Speaker John Hanson, welcome to In the Moment. Thanks. Nice to see you again here
good
in
to
Sioux
see
Falls.
you again. Absolutely. It's always good to be with you.
You had a lot that's happened since the last time we talked, because I think the last time was a Meet the Candidates interview.
All right.
It's been a minute.
It has.
Speaker of the House, and now announcing your desires to be governor for the state of South Dakota. Tell me about the conversation. Was it a conversation between you and Carla Lems? Was it a conversation between you and your wife, family members? How did it begin that you wanted to make this run at this time?
Well, it's a lot of that. It's a lot of different conversations with a lot of different people, and of course, it starts with, really like I do everything, asking God what God's calling me to do, and then discerning that and pursuing that. So that's always the first step for me, and then of course conversations with Sheila, my wife. We've got 6 kids at home. Our oldest is 13. Our youngest is a year and a half. And so anything that I do, they got to be on board too. It's a mission together, our family. So everything's got to have buy-in from the family, of course. And then, of course, talking to a lot of people and getting a lot of encouragement from people from across the state who think that we can do better in our executive branch. And they look to me and they look to my experience in the legislature, my experience as Speaker of the House, my role in a lot of these major issues that we've seen come up before the people of this state, and my willingness to stand on the front lines of those fights and really push for the conservative agenda. A lot of those things just came together, and it seemed like this is the right time, this is the right moment, the right opportunity to step up and take on the opportunity to serve the people as governor.
All right. A little bit about your background. Kid from Del Rapids?
That's right. I was born in Yankton.
Okay.
And moved to Del Rapids when I was just a kid, so I did all my growing up in Del Rapids. Met Sheila. She was my high school girlfriend. Ended up marrying her, and we have, like I said earlier, 6 kids. And we love Del Rapids. We love small town Del Rapids. Del Rapids is just under 4,000. It's probably over 4,000 now. Mm-hmm. But we love small town community and sort of just the South Dakota small town way of life, And so we've been raising our family in Del Rapids, and we wouldn't have it any other way.
And you spent some time milking cows, which was unusual. Tell us that story.
Yeah. Well, when Sheila and I were dating in high school, she was growing up on the farm. She was a farm girl, and I was a town kid. And so I knew if there was one place that she would always be at where I'd go hang out with her after school, it was the family milking barn. And so I spent a lot of time hanging out with Sheila, milking cows at the family milking barn. So I like to say, I think I hold the unofficial South Dakota record for the most dairy cows milked by a town kid in South Dakota history. I've heard that's in dispute, but I think I hold it.
There's a comp. Can you still milk a cow?
Absolutely. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
What's hard about it?
It's actually not that difficult.
Okay, all right.
No, it just takes time.
I've never milked a cow, so my confession there is now. You talk about some of the issues that you've been successful with, Amendment G, carbon capture pipeline, sort of motivating people to speak out against that. When we think about ballot initiatives in South Dakota, we often think of the social issues and where the Democrats might be successful on the ballot. These were successful issues on the ballot for perhaps a different area of the political spectrum. But often in South Dakota, the executive is right in the middle, is a in-the-middle Republican, and some of those side issues, social issues, end up being fought out in our ballot process. When you're successful with one, how does that translate to actually getting to the governor's office? Because now you have to convince everybody in South Dakota that you're the leader that they need.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I've shown throughout my entire time in the legislature, I've been serving now in the state legislature I just did my 10th session. And so obviously when you're in there for that long, you take on a whole host of issues. And it's not just the social issues, it's the nuts and bolts, And I've also served on a lot of interim committees like the Rules Review Committee. Rules Review Committee takes on all of the administrative rules that come into the state. And anytime those get proposed by the administration, we have to look at those to make sure that they're within the authority that's been delegated to them by the legislature. And so, you kind of hear about the big issues in the news, like Amendment G, which we fought and defeated, like the eminent domain issue, private property rights, which we, passed a bill this last legislative session to make sure that these companies can't just come in and use eminent domain to take your land without your consent, which I think is very important. So those issues tend to get a lot of attention, but there's a ton of issues that are happening all the time that are just sort of the nuts and bolts of the government, how things function, the essential services, and I've got a ton of experience handling those issues as well.
Also, Lieutenant Governor candidate and yourself, southeast corner of the state. You got to reach the whole state. You got to head up to Sisseton. You
Yeah,
got to head
that's right.
to Lemon and everywhere in between and get that name recognition. Which some of the polls early on, which are not really worth paying a whole lot of attention to, but not everybody knows who you are.
Sure.
How are you going to get out in the state and get people? What's your plan for the summer?
Yeah, well, the summer is already jam-packed, and it's only going to get fuller. And we've been out there. It's a Rapid City. We went up to Bennington County for their Lincoln Day dinner. We were out there for a launch event. We did a launch event out there just not this weekend, but the weekend before. We were in Lawrence County for their Lincoln Day dinner and had another reception. And I tell you, the meetings that we've had with ranchers in the area and some other folks out there have really been overwhelmingly positive. I think people are excited for this vision that we have for the state, putting people first again, putting faith and family and freedom really at the forefront of our focus as a state government. So the more that we get out there, the reception has just been tremendous, and so we're just going to keep going all over the state and spreading the good word and meeting more folks. And I think it's going to be great.
Faith, family, freedom, strength, family first, family values. These are all things that I think a lot of candidates on the Republican side ahead of the primary are going to lead with. How do you distinguish yourself in what really could arguably be a very crowded field?
Well, I think when you're looking for somebody who stands for those issues, what I want is a proven fighter. I want somebody who I can point to and look at and think, you know what? Yeah, they don't just talk the talk, but they've been walking the walk over all of these years. And that's something that I've been doing, and I know that's something that Carla Lems, my lieutenant governor candidate, has been doing as well. And so when you look at faith and family and freedom and those issues that I think are important to all of us, and you go back to the fight for life with Amendment G, I was at the forefront of that. We started an organization called the Life Defense Fund, and Life Defense Fund led the effort to defeat that constitutional amendment that the overwhelming majority of South Dakota agreed is wrong for our South Dakota Constitution. When you look at the property rights fight in the state, and constitutional private property rights were under threat, and hundreds of people in the state were getting sued for their land to be condemned by an out-of-state for-profit, foreign-backed company, I was at the front lines of that fight, defending people. Then you look at all the other issues, those bigger ones that have come up in this state. We have really been leading the way to make sure that our South Dakota way of life is protected and preserved. And so that's what is really going to differentiate us from anybody else, I think, who is going to get into this race. We are tested, we are proven, we are battle tested. We have been in the trenches on these fights, and when your back is up against the wall, you want somebody who you know is going to stand up for you. That's me, and that's Carla Lems, and I think that's what we bring to the table.
Let's talk a little bit about the South Dakota economy, economic growth, economic development, but also, as you have said, free market should be running this and not incentives and tax breaks for corporations. Help us understand exactly what you mean and how you would do things different than, say, the Kristi Noem or the Larry Roden administration.
Well, I am a classic free market Republican. I believe in low taxation and low regulation and letting small, medium-sized businesses and South Dakota entrepreneurs really go out and create amazing businesses, which we've seen throughout the decades in this state. The tremendous businesses that have been built by South Dakota entrepreneurs are really astounding. And there's some that are trying to get away from that. And what we see is, instead of trusting the free market and our entrepreneurs, the state is getting involved and putting sort of the heavy thumb of government on this project or that project, taking taxpayer money from these businesses and giving it over to that business instead. This sort of redistribution scheme that we've seen play out over the years. And so, a couple of examples that come to mind. One, for instance, there was a company up in the Madison area that was going to set up a shrimping operation called True Shrimp. and they were going to build this shrimp farm, so to speak, in Madison. And so the state goes and gives them millions of dollars in incentives to build their building and their business in South Dakota. Well, guess what? It never happened. And so the taxpayers are just out millions of dollars for a business that never even came to South Dakota. So that's money that was taxed from some of our businesses, so our people, given to this company, and they never even came and did anything in South Dakota. It's never a benefit to any of us.
So would you recommend more oversight, or would you recommend not having those incentives or tax incentives? Like, what does it look like in practical? Because a lot of the businesses in South Dakota who have been incredibly successful have come to South Dakota and chosen us instead of Minnesota, instead of North Dakota, because we have made it attractive, because we've been open for business or open for opportunity. Does that end under your administration, or just reform?
Well, I think what's been most attractive to people across the country, and we've seen it especially since COVID, is just our reputation for freedom. That's what's attractive to people. And you look at all the people who've moved to South Dakota to bring their family or their business over, especially these last 5 years. It's not because some big crony corporate payout from the government. It's because we have low regulation, low tax environment, and we have a reputation for freedom in this state. So those are the things that I want to focus on. I don't think it's appropriate that the government hand out millions and millions of dollars in corporate welfare payments to businesses who don't need it. And so I wouldn't do that.
To the Governor's Department of Economic Development, does that budget shrink? Does the department go away? You said in your announcement that, day one, South Dakota Doge, and people cheered. What does that mean to you? Where exactly does South Dakota Doge? Where do you start looking for those places to cut in the economic development world?
Well, definitely at the Governor's Office of Economic Development. And so, you got to look in terms of what is that doing that's actually a good function of state government. And if there's things that they're doing that are effective, then maybe you keep those. But all of this corporate welfare spending and kickbacks to political donors that we've seen over the years, those have got to end. And I'm committing to ending those things.
Do you come in with a blanket percentage cut? Do you hire someone, bring someone with you to look at those things? Do you already know what they are as Speaker of the House and as with your experience as a state legislator?
Well, there's a mix. This last legislative session, for instance, we looked at eliminating the Future Fund. And the Future Fund is a massive fund. I can't remember exactly what the number is off the top of my head, but maybe it was $70 million or something like that, that the state is taking from all of the small and medium-sized businesses in the state, taking their money from them and redistributing to other businesses. Some businesses, by the way, who end up competing with them. So it's not like it's, inviting just new businesses who aren't doing anything in the state in terms of that particular sector or this particular business model. It might be your own competition that the state is incentivizing to come compete with you. I don't think that's fair to our South Dakota businesses. So those sorts of things, that's one particular example. Mm. But then I also think, generally speaking, when you talk about South Dakota Doge, the state government has just gotten too big over the years. And I think back to my first year in the legislature, which was 2011, and the state had a $127 million budget deficit. And at the time, that represented basically 10% of the state.
Deficit?
Yeah, we had a deficit. Yeah, $127 million budget deficit in 2011. Yeah.
But we have to balance our budget every year.
Right. But
so help me understand what you mean there.
Well, at the time, we were using one-time money to pay for ongoing expenses. And to me and a lot of other people, that's not truly a balanced budget. Now, since then, you might remember we passed a constitutional amendment to make sure that we structurally balance the budget. It wasn't the case back then. And so my first year in office, we did have a $127 million budget deficit. And I campaigned at the time to say, I'm going to go in there and I will not vote to raise your taxes. We're going to cut the government in order to solve that budget deficit. And that's what we did at the time. So now you fast forward, the government is even bigger. It's more bloated. And I think it's time once again to look across the board to say, what are we spending all this money on? And really, we need to trim back because people are getting taxed too much, particularly at the property tax level. And I think the most appropriate way to reduce those property tax burdens on people is to really look at the size of government, trim it down, and then allow those savings to go down to the people so they can pay less in taxes and spend their own money the way they want to spend it.
Do you have a sense of departments that need to be cut across the board, services that need to be reduced? Because we're a pretty low tax, low service state as it is. And people always say, where else is there left to cut? It's been a really tough, plus we're seeing, reduction in what's coming from the federal government. So there isn't a lot of extra money. There's not a lot of fat. You're seeing fat where?
Well, I mean, you look at a lot of what we just talked about, some of this crony capitalism spending. That's a lot of fat that I think needs to be trimmed. I'll give you one other example of that. We have a building in Sioux Falls. There's one in Rapid City. It's called South Dakota One Stop. That's an office building that the state leases out now from a private developer. And that office building, because of the way that the administration did it, is costing the state of South Dakota, the taxpayers of this state, $300 million over a 30-year lease that they've locked us into. $300 million over a 30-year lease. Now, when that lease term expires, we own nothing. All we have is the ability to go beg for a lease renewal. Now, compare that to, well, just down the street from here is the Citibank building. The Citibank building could have been bought for $33, $34 million. The state could have owned it. It's actually more square footage than the One Stop building, and we would have saved hundreds of millions of dollars. But we didn't do that. Why didn't we do that? I don't know, but that's a bad deal for taxpayers. And so that's a great example of that's hundreds of millions of dollars in wasteful spending that we could just avoid if we're making better decisions.
So what's your commitment then? Because legislators didn't have an idea of what exactly was happening with that Sioux Falls One Stop, for example, and complained about what they knew and what they didn't know. If I remember this correctly, you would remember it more than I would because you were right in the thick of it. What's your commitment then, day one, as Governor Hansen, to say, I'm going to make sure that the state legislature is part of the decision-making process?
Well, that's a good question for many reasons. But one of the things that we've seen as a legislative branch is really the administration's unwillingness to fully open up the books. And you talk to some of our appropriators, and they'll share that with you. When you start to drill down, below, to sort of like lower tier spending, not just like big, broad categorical spending on agencies and stuff like that, but when you really try to drill down as to what agencies are spending their money on, it's really difficult to get that information, even as a legislative branch. And so one of the things that I want to do as a governor, having served in the administration, is to help restore that balance of power, empower the legislature with more information in terms of what the budget actually is, what the administration is actually spending money on, because the more people, the more transparency when it comes to how our budget process works and how our spending is, I think the more we'll have better decisions made in terms of how we actually spend that money.
I want to circle back for our remaining time to economic growth. How do we measure, what are you're for a free market. Do you have data that you're going to measure and say this is working? If you become governor and things shrink a little bit and businesses aren't coming here and people get a little nervous, does that even out over time? Or are you less concerned about growth than other things? Do you think your growth plan is going to be bigger and build a bigger, more economically robust South Dakota? Help us understand how you look at performance goals and measurement beyond the philosophy of, hey, this is what should happen, to what are the results and outcomes going to be of this plan if we commit to it and move forward?
Well, I think if we are willing to boldly move forward with a conservative, pro-freedom agenda in this state, where we have low taxes and low regulation, businesses will flock to this state. It's already attractive now because we don't have an income tax. Imagine if we had a significantly more reduced property tax system. How many more people would want to come to this state, have their family live here, do business in this state, because we champion freedom, low taxes, and low regulation. So that is the way. That is the success story that we've seen in America. I mean, if you look at the American economy and you look at the whole scope of even human civilization, you look at Western civilization, you think, what has been the biggest driver of economic growth, it is without a doubt the free market. And so we just need to get back to trusting that. And if we trust the free market, we trust entrepreneurs, we trust people to make the best decisions with their money, then the economy will just flourish. And South Dakota will absolutely thrive with great businesses and great jobs.
John Hanson, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.